Hey guys, thanks for joining me for another Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia video. Today we are taking on the new Dimensions End Tier 14, and this is the one that dropped with Kurasame FRBT, right? So we went in here. This is going to be a duo fight, so we are doing Rubicante and Kurasame. Now, I wanted to do this solo Rubicante, but the bosses have just enough gimmick that I found it very difficult. Now, it might be possible. But just based on what I read on the enemies and when I did actually attempt it, you kind of get locked to a point where you can't deal damage to the enemies, right? And I felt like the fight was just going to go on forever. Basically, the way these guys work is once you hit certain thresholds, they require having a debuff on that as a stacking debuff. Otherwise, what they do is they reduce your damage to basically nothing. The other thing that these guys have that'll trip you up is when they enter their force time, it's a 15-turn force, so it lasts like a very long time. And it's troublesome because it essentially does a freeze to you. So if you want to know what Kurasame's BT effect is, basically these guys do it, but they do it back at you. And when you can't Brave Gain, you can't deal damage, right? Now, there are some ways around this, right? Like right here, Vieira's Punishment, this is a debuff with a stack on it. But they're really pushing Kurasame here because Kurasame's debuff stacks up to 5 and it maxes at 5 stacks. Well, the requirement says if even you have to be something with a stack that goes at least 1 or higher is one requirement. And then as it gets more stacks, they get easier to kill or whatever. But then if it goes 6 or higher, then it reverts back. So Vieira's Punishment I believe goes up to 10. So if that's your only stacking debuff, I think it doesn't actually work. But you could bring a Kurasame Call, right? So the problem though with trying to do Kurasame Call on a solo run with Rubicante is the enemies will take a bunch of turns and eventually that buff is gonna wear off and then you won't have it anymore. But maybe if you spread it out enough, maybe it'll work. I just did one run with Rubicante before I knew that they required the stacking debuff, and I'm like, well, I'll just come in here with Kurasame and Rubicante. So I'm doing Rubicante setup. I'm basically just using his Blizzara attack to charge up. We got the force gauge at 100. I had used Luna Freya before this, so I got a few extra turns here. But yeah, it's pretty much just make sure they have the stacking buff on from Kurasame. And then I'm going into FR now at this point. I'm fully stacked up. I've got the BT effect up, and we should be good to go. So yeah, we're hopping in here now. What happens is and you see why Rubicante is better alone, because Kurasame just kind of gets in his way. It's basically what happens. Kurasame just gets in his way. But yeah, so we're going to go through here, and so actually, yeah, we're using the BT effect now, so we're all set up. Yep, because we're just finishing out the burst phase. Perfect. And then what we'll do is Kurasame will go into force on his next turn. So that force we were doing was actually in the middle of a burst phase. So we actually went a little bit farther than we needed to, but that's fine. The enemies will take turns, we'll get double counters, all that stuff. But I am really liking kind of the setup for Rubicante. You basically do a couple of charge attacks, use the LD, go into his burst phase. You get a free skill use in his burst phase because you just use the LD. Use that on your charging move. Use the LD again in burst phase. Use the charging move again and then move it again. So you get a lot of force charging. It's a very atypical way to run a burst phase, but that's really what's optimal with Rubicante, because when you're doing solo fights, his burst phase is a way to ensure that he gets a lot of turns to just get the gauge charged up. And then you just pop the force and it's pretty much auto mode at that point. You guys saw my solo video, right? So it's really, Rubicante's just so busted. And I think having a third member in my party would actually make this fight more difficult, right? I could see something having Kane or Frey in the air would be really good, but they still eventually get turns and then they fall back down and they kind of get in your way and then it wastes force. So I feel like the less characters you can have with Rubicante, the better, because your force just lasts longer, right? That's really what it is. You want your force to last as long as possible. Even with Kurasame, though, we do get a lot out of this. And you can see we enter force time. The enemies are 92%. We're going to incinerate them out of here before we even leave this force time. And this solves so many problems getting it done in one force, because they don't get a chance to get their force up, because their force is kind of a problem because they do an attack that auto cuts your HP down to half. They kind of freeze you. Things get really difficult. And so at that point, they're pushing you to use Kurasame FR because you need his FR to cancel it pretty much. Because it's very specific. I think it has to be ice damage, I think it has to be melee, and it has to inflict a stacking debuff. So literally the things that basically only Kurasame does. Very difficult to inflict with other FRs, so they're really calling for Kurasame if you need to cancel it. So I do think a strat you could do on this fight. So let's say you don't have Kurasame, you know, and you don't, or maybe you don't have him built up enough to be in the party, and you want to find a way around this fight. I think what you could do, as long as you have force charging, so like if you do a typical setup with, you know, like a Selfie or a Lunafreya or somebody, or Penelo, right? Somebody that can force charge. You do like a really insane DPS. I think like Reigns would work really well here because he would just do a lot of damage. Or Tifa, I think, could do really well here. You do that, have them on there, and then you just have a way to get into your force burst setup before they hit their force, and you probably can do enough damage if you have a good enough damage dealer. To just power through. And then the way you deal with their stacking buff mechanic in that instance, you could get away with the Kurasame call if you're running a more speedy setup where it's not passive. Rubicante doesn't work as well at the call because it relies on giving the enemies a lot of turns. They burn through the debuff. But if I'm doing a more aggressive approach where I'm kind of staying in front of the enemies, I'm just rushing into my burst phase and doing all the damage with the DPS, then Kurasame call is going to be sufficient because that call will stay on them until they get X number of turns. And so as long as that debuff is on, I could go crazy, do my entire force time. They can go through all their thresholds. I'm still going to deal damage because they've got that. So I think that's kind of the two approaches, right? You do a really aggressive DPS approach with a call if you need it, or you do something like what I'm doing, Rubicante with, say, Kurasame on the team to keep reapplying it. You know, if you didn't have Kurasame, you could just pick another character that has a stacking debuff. It's just got to be something that's between 1 and 5. I know it's kind of odd, but that's what you would have to do, right? Or other calls that can get that done. And you can let me know in the comments like what other strategies you've tried. I'm sure there's lots of like clever team runs on this. Obviously, this is, being that it's Dimensions on 14, this is going to be restrictive to a lot of players because we're locked out of any previous characters used. You do have the option to go back and unlock them if you need to. But for me, I happen to have Kurasame and obviously Rubicante because he's brand new. So I'm like, yep, let's just do it. Get these guys rolling. But you'll see some of my attacks only deal 1 brave damage. It has to do with like what stack we're at on the buff. So the best is when they're at 5 stacks. But then when the enemies get a turn, they go back down to 1 stack, and then we go back to dealing 1 brave damage. But if you don't have a stacking debuff on them at all, you literally just do zeros. So they are pushing that with Kurasame, right? All right, so we're just rolling along here. We're about halfway through our force. The enemies are about halfway dead. But exponentially, we're going to start hitting way harder numbers now because our gauge is getting really high. Oh, the other restriction I didn't even mention with this fight. They reduce brave damage from anything but fire and ice. So that's the other big restriction on this fight, is you have to have fire or ice damage. So I do feel like this is a fight where Neon could come into play and be a really good party member to have. Especially, Neon's really impactful too. Like if you wanted to run a character, say like, maybe Garnet or another character with elements, and you want to overwrite their elements with fire. Although I'm pretty sure their other elements are still present, so I'm not sure how that would operate if the fire damage would come through or if it would resist the other. That may not work, but at least you would have Neon either way to enchant non-elemental characters, and then Rubicante does it as well. So you really want to bring like fire or ice enchant if you can. You could bring it on a call if you need to. I guess I would have to test it. But I'm pretty sure the wording was resist all brave damage except fire and ice. I'm not sure if that also includes non-elemental. Non-elemental might be okay on its own, but the way it was worded, I was thinking it has to be fire or ice, but I could be wrong on that. But yeah, you know the type of player I am, right? Like I go in, path of least resistance. I'm like, yeah, I think Rubicante is going to make this easy. Like I said, I did try a Rubicante solo, and he would absolutely annihilate this fight. Like ridiculously, if we didn't have the issue where we did 0 damage. And I let it run for a while, and we were basically going to go almost infinitely, because Rubicante like never gets turns when you run solo. He is so slow. The enemies get a ton of turns, but like, yeah, we were just sitting there forever dealing zeros. I went and read the enemies and was like, how do I get the zeros off? Oh, inflict with a level debuff. Well, I don't have that, so I kind of just gave up on that fight, and I said, yeah, I already had Kurasame. I used him on one of the tiers. Plus, there's a ticket mission anyway, so I'm like, yeah, let's just put Kurasame in there, and we'll just get it done. All right, so now we're about 900%. The other strat here I did with Kurasame is you'll notice I did not echo with him early. And the reason why is his Echo doesn't get a huge gain from Rubicante because you really need fire damage to get a good gain, and Kurasame's giving himself ice. So if I do a normal Echo with Kurasame, it only gives 25%, which isn't a crazy amount. So my thought is, let's just build up the gauge ourselves. Let Kurasame take normal turns, and then when the gauge is at like cap, then we'll pop the force for like huge damage, right? So here comes the second Echo. We did do one earlier when I was chatting about whatever. I think it was probably on his previous turn. But we are going to get very, very good damage here. So let's see, on that Echo, yeah, it was just, we got that. Yeah, 22 mil with 14 mil splash killed the other guy. And I figured that was the way to do it, because these enemies can get kind of crazy at the end of a fight. So to save that big burst attack for at the end, to really just wipe them out and put them out of their misery. And there you go, finished them on the counter. This overall was a very clean run. Like, we definitely got through just fine here. And let's see, this was a 16 turn clear, not too bad. And most of it was just ramping up with Rubicante at the beginning, right? So anyways, guys, let me know how your Dimensions End 14 went. This is my run right here. Thanks for watching. We'll catch y'all on the next one.